Welcome to Keiser Report, Summer Solutions. I'm Max Keiser here with Stacy Herbert. You know, we look at the solutions, take a deep dive into the issues we've been chatting about all year. Now, today, we're going to be talking with Nathaniel Whittemore, also known as NLW of the Breakdown Podcast. Been following him on Twitter for a long time, listened to his podcast. You know, the great thing about this whole new universe of media, Stacy, is that people who might not get on media, and then they rise to the top, and suddenly they're like, wow, these people are awesome. And I would put Nathaniel in that camp. What do you think?
Well, that's the good thing about talking to heterodox thinkers, because we don't have to just stick with the orthodox guys that are so boring on all the mainstream cable news channels. We have the best guests. So, you know, Nathaniel, I want to talk to you about one of the themes that we've presented here on Keiser Report's Summer Solutions is that we're coming out of a fiat dark ages, and that this could be an opportunity for a Renaissance 2.0. And what we saw back in the previous Renaissance, coming out of the dark ages and the Black Plague, was that the plague did help bring in the Renaissance in that it undermined the authority of the Vatican. Nowadays, we see, in my opinion, the equivalent of the central banks are like the Vatican. There's this like cabal of elite who only know all the secret information about our financial system, our monetary system, and our economics, and they're going to rescue or save everything. But there seems to be, like with this pandemic and also with the increasing like collapse of the economy and markets, and then the bailouts and all that sort of stuff, that there's an undermining of their authority going on, and that this is a moment now where we could have a rebirth.
I mean, absolutely. The only addition that I would say is that I don't think that there's not just a single equivalent to the Vatican, in the sense that there's not just one authority that's being undermined. I think that there's multiple authorities being undermined. You have, on the one hand, I think that you're absolutely right to identify that the central banks have been exposed not as bad by definition or any way, just as like extremely limited in what they can do, and they keep doing the same thing over and over again. They ignore, and this is the part where it gets a little willful, they ignore the role that they have in issues like income inequality, right, by virtue of their policies. And people are reacting in really interesting ways. I think it's been very notable how over the course of the pandemic, when you've seen the sort of money printer go Brrr meme, it's not a Bitcoin Twitter thing. That is on Wall Street bets. It's on, I mean, it's everywhere, right? That idea of the Fed put translated to the Fed's going to do whatever to keep these zombie companies alive has been manifest far beyond just the Twitter sphere into a totally different realms. And I think you have a lot of forces combining with that to make people ask big questions. And it's very rare that you have a situation where people are allowed to ask big questions for any suspended period of time, and there not be major changes that come out on the other side of that.
Right, but on the topic of central banks, so central banks are the basis upon which the monetization of the economy has occurred, and it has sucked all the great talent out of the university system who moved to Wall Street to become quants and financial engineers, and they didn't go into medicine really so much, or legal affairs, or social service, or become clergymen. They became Wall Street traders. And with the Fed, we know historically, and as an example of an institution that is replicated in other countries around the world, there is a natural interest rate of about 5%, and the Fed their remit is to either raise or lower rates around that natural rate as a way to offer a mitigating risk to the economy in case there's a slowdown or things get hyperinflated, et cetera. But what we've seen is that they've taken rates down to zero and allowed the cantillionaire class to buy everything up, which has given the rise to the multi-hundred billionaire class. That's a result of what I think we can describe as a heist. This is a heist engineered by the Fed and put further along by the cantillionaire class. So this is pretty shocking disaster in a lot of ways. And First, so what's your comment on that? Would you see it that way? Am I over dramatizing something here? And if that is the case, it seems structurally there's very little that can be done at this point. Your thoughts?
Well, so there's two things that in that question that you asked. One is, can anything be done? Let's come to that one second. The first is whether there is whether this is a heist. And I guess what I would say is a couple things. First of all, the Fed's remit isn't necessarily to keep interest rates around a specific level. It is to keep the economy stable, and more recently to also have low unemployment. Right. The problem is that the only tool they have is this interest rate tool, or the increasingly exotic forms of QE tool, right? And because of that, the only mechanism that they have to actually interact with the economy has to do with liquidity injections effectively, And what happens because of that is that the only people who benefit are the people closest to them, right? And that's exactly what you talk about with the cantillionaire class. I think what's happening now is that people are realizing that the Fed may backstop the markets, but the markets don't necessarily offer the average person anything anymore. And in fact, if anything, they have made it more inaccessible to actually participate in the means of getting ahead, right? We've had a situation happen where the deal that is being handed to regular people is everything is going to be more expensive than it was for your parents, but the bargain is that we'll give you cheaper credit to buy it, which is a terrible deal. It's an awful deal, right? Like, we'll let you get farther and farther into debt because the percentage rates are lower and lower and lower, but you're going to have to take on more of that debt to participate in any meaningful way. And this is where you have all of this inequality happening. I think the interesting thing that may be happening right now, and it's way too early to be anything more than the most very basic level of optimistic about this, is that there may be open space for a political conversation that isn't the same boring narratives of right and left that are presented to us right now, but actually looks at this, at monetary policy as a structural cause that can actually combine people across right and left and say, this is something that we can wrap our heads around and doesn't fall into the same old narratives and is actually addressable. And that's something that I think I've been thinking about a lot, and frankly testing on my friends on both sides. And I think that there's more openness there, and maybe that's one of the upshots of this moment that we're living in.
Right, right. I mean, we can kind of discuss further what the remit of the Fed is, right? But to your point, the key here is that both left and right are now focusing on the institution as a whole, and what role it plays in a lot of these big issues. And I think that is really important, Stacy.
So let's, wrap some of those issues up into one overriding question and then some solutions to it. You mentioned all the debt, and that's been the bargain, is like, okay, all your costs are going up, healthcare costs, living costs, education costs, all that stuff is going up. The basic fundamental needs of your life, those costs are going up. Some of the Chinese imported goods, okay, they're going down. But debt has been rising everywhere across all sectors. So right now in 2020, we see that the US debt to GDP is 136%. I believe just in 2005, yes, it was only 61%. So it's doubled since 2005, but household debt is also rising. Corporate debt is even rising even more. Paul Krugman says it's just debt we owe to ourselves. So is this debt an issue at all?
Well, I mean, it's certainly an issue for the average American who's holding that debt, and I think that's what makes, again, going back to what's potential in this moment. I think that the average American who hears that thinks, BS, you know what I mean? Like, that can't be the case. How is it that we live in a system where that's the case for the highest levels of government, but not for me, right? And where does the translation happen where all of a sudden debt becomes okay? Like, how big do you have to be for that to happen? And when people dig into it, they realize that there's basically no way to actually ever pay this debt back. And so really we're in this weird situation where it's so strange to see that the solutions that are being presented, you have on the one hand the MMTers who are kind of pushing this narrative, and in a strange way I find them the most arrogant about the place of the US dollar in the world. There is such an underlying assumption that nothing can change in terms of the global power system, and any student of history knows that that's simply not the case, right? And how bad, the thing that's crazy is that we're living in a moment where the US really is rewriting the book every day about how far you can push different things. And the problem is you have exactly basically two opinions within that, or two ways to look at it. The one is that, well, we've gotten away with it so far, so we're going to be able to keep getting away with it. The second is, at some point that's no longer the case, and maybe we should have a little less hubris about the things that make us look better. This is an area of American exceptionalism that could be extremely dangerous the moment that it tips. And there's a million different statistics, a million different ways you can look at where that tipping point is. Right now, we are still living in a world where it's not like the rest of the world is presenting a really great alternative, but you have, for the first time, these really key geostrategic competitions that are expressly coming after the way that the world is organized around the US dollar. And basically the whole system, the being able to get away with the way that we've structured things, is predicated on a continuance of a system which doesn't necessarily serve a lot of folks, including, I think, and this is the new heterodox thought that is starting to come into the conversation, maybe it doesn't serve the interests of the US quite as the way that it used to.
Right. Is there a tipping point for American exceptionalism? And are we at that tipping point? I mean, that's a very good kind of question. And Goldman Sachs, on the topic of the dollar, has come out and said it believes that the dollar's days are numbered. So in terms of the dollar being world reserve currency, Goldman Sachs saying looks like the end is near. How would this factor into things?
I mean, it has a huge ramification, and I think that the debates around the dollar are really interesting and also extremely important. You have, on the one hand, the folks who are focused on the narrative strength of the dollar in some ways, right? That Goldman article that you referred to that came out as part of the gold report was kind of trying to make sense of why gold has had such a rise. And in particular, why it's not just the standard folks who are kind of re-upping their allocations of gold, but is in fact institutions who are getting more and more skeptical of treasuries and saying maybe part of what used to be the government debt role in our portfolio should in fact be this other thing, because there's skepticism around the dollar. You have folks on the other side who are really focused on the fundamentals and basically the kind of Eurodollar and shadow banking system, and just how much of the dollar denominated debt in the world is outside the purview of the US. Those folks are more skeptical of things like the Fed's ability to actually influence the monetary supply. They see the dollar's strength as predicated not on any sort of narrative, but on the fundamentals. I can appreciate both points of view, but I always worry when we underestimate narratives when it comes to markets. Markets are ultimately machines that make sense of narratives and fundamentals in some confusing combination. And at any given moment, they can move very quickly between one or the other. And in fact, they are in some ways competition for narratives that win. There are people always who are going to have a benefit for the dollar to come down. And some of those powers include some of the most powerful actors in the world right now. So I think being dismissive of narrative shifts and a shift in the Overton window on whether the dollar can be or should be the world's reserve currency would be a mistake.
Right. Well, very well said. Well, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, more with Nathaniel Whittemore of the Breakdown Podcast. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report Summer Solutions with Max and Stacy, and we're talking to Nathaniel Whittemore. He's got the Breakdown Podcast. I get it now. He breaks stuff down. I'm getting the benefit of his breakdown right now. This guy's on the money. Now, in the previous segment, Nathaniel, we were talking about narratives and markets, and how sometimes they're in sync, sometimes they break. When they break, it can happen really quickly. And, markets are very efficient. As you say, they're a machine, if you will. They take in all the information. They have price discovery going on, and you see a price, and you can kind of figure out what all the opinions are. And that's what they're supposed to be doing. That's the beauty of them. But sometimes narratives take control, and markets get way out of whack. And in the case of the U.S. dollar, it might be the case where the narrative is taking the dollar in a place that is not reflective of reality. And that when reality asserts itself, we're going to see a huge kind of move in the dollar versus some of these other currencies, or not. But I think it's good to kind of point out that these two things don't always go together, Stacy.
Yeah, Nathaniel, I want to turn to a little bit about what we're discussing in terms of narrative. And one of the things that is really emerging is this conflict between the United States and China. Secretary of State Pompeo said that China, he accused them of economic blitzkrieg. But how much of it is really China and how much is actually the structure of the global fiat system whereby the dollar is a reserve currency? Yes, it is an exorbitant privilege in some ways for some people, but it does undermine our ability to manufacture and produce wealth. So what do you think about that statement?
Well, so I mean, I think that it is almost regardless of what you think about the conflict. I think it is the defining economic conflict of our times. Even if you don't view it as inherently or by definition adversarial, inherently, in some ways, it is going to inevitably be such an important conflict just based on the size of these economies. I think it's important to remember that the way that the world has organized itself was not random. We made a concerted push to bring China into the World Trade Organization and to basically aid the way that the world shifted to have such low price manufacturing of things in China, right? There would be, no matter what, even if we hadn't done that, a certain sort of power dynamic that probably China would start to bristle against as they reasserted themselves in the world, that comes from the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar at the center of the world's reserve currency system. But it wasn't like there was just some economic inevitability of manufacturing of all ways moving to China and supply chains moving to China. Those were specific decisions. And I think one of the things that's most noticeable about the time that we're living through now is that you go back 10 years and it was the American business class, big corporates basically, that were the most sort of the last offenders of China, right? They were the ones who were saying, look, look at how many people it's brought out of poverty. This has been a great experiment. And that's not happening anymore. There is a major shift. And I think this is one of the most significant forces going on right now to reshore things, to bring them back home. And you've talked about that, or you've seen this being talked about for a while, but the virus has supercharged it, right? Japan, when they did their first round of post-COVID rebuilding, put in billions of dollars of incentives for Japanese companies to come home, right? Japan is in many ways the most worried about China outside of the US. They are beating down the door of the US saying they need to provide an economic counterweight, particularly when it comes to things like the new Chinese central bank digital currency that's being tested. But you see it in the US now too, right? You're starting to see this massive conversation, and I think it's going to be supercharged by the vaccine hunt of how we redesign supply chains for national security, not just economic interests. So there's so much involved in the US-China relationship. I think the dollar is a part of it. And, the reality is that China, from a narrative standpoint, really has to tell the story that the yuan is a good reserve currency, because as it relates to an actual percentage of the world's reserves, it's not, right? It's a distantly behind the euro and the US dollar.
Right. Well, there's a perfect example of narratives meets markets, right? So for years, the narrative was there's a symbiotic relationship between the U.S. and China. They send us really cheap goods, and we can get widescreen TVs for really cheap and clothes really cheap, and we just send them their jobs, and it's really a great relationship, and it'll never break. It'll never be disturbed because it's so beneficial for everybody. And then suddenly COVID happens, and the entire narrative is ripped to shreds, and markets assert themselves, and they're being onshored. And the president's saying in the case of TikTok that they need to sell their TikTok. There are all these crazy market reactions. So that's a good example of that. Now, it was recently reported that 75% of Americans are making more on their enhanced unemployment benefits than they did working. Your thoughts on this, and what does it tell you about the structure of our economy, Nathaniel?
Well, there's a lot of different arguments around this. You have the folks who say that unemployment benefits are supposed to set the floor for prices, and that this is a natural reset. And I think that that's one perspective. There's another set of people who think that we've created a kind of perverse incentive by doing things backwards and reactionary. And I think that the first conversation is a good one to have. We should be, every 4 years, as part of elections, having a larger structural conversation about what the social contract should look like, like what unemployment should be. Like that should be a perpetual conversation that people are having, because we live in a society with other people and we get to decide what's the right and the wrong approach. However, what we are doing is policy by reaction. We were slow to react to COVID-19 as a serious threat. We denied, and got ourselves in a situation where we had to do big, stupid, overarching things. And that's what we're dealing with now. And we're going to get into the same situation again, right? There's a battle now about should we extend these benefits for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, because Republicans and Democrats can't get together to figure out what they actually want. And I think that there's a kind of a broad point and a short-term point. A short-term point has to do with just how poorly equipped to deal with dynamic situations our system is right now. And there's a lot of reasons we could diagnose that, but it's depressing to see. The second point, which is maybe a little bit longer term, and is something that I think should be a part of the debate about UBI and any of these concepts that are coming down the pipe, is what it looks like is there any actual realistic way to implement any of these systems while avoiding political capture in some way? Because you kind of have a scenario now where no one feels like they can argue that no extension of benefits is the right approach or anything like that, because it is just the expectation that people want their money. So I think we're in a very complicated moment as it relates to the relationship between government and citizens, because I think citizens rightly feel like they haven't been represented, so they might as well get their stupid check, and that's a dangerous spot to be in.
And speaking of complicated moments, we've posited here on Keiser Report that not only are we at a fourth turning, so we see the exit of the baby boomers who lived in a fiat generation. They were the first in on a global pyramid scheme, and they did well off of it. But now we have this Generation Z, and it's a radical fourth turning, and their mindset is completely different. I don't understand it at all, I can say. We also have the Thucydides trap. These are epic moments in history as well. There's like 12 or 13 big ones, and we're at another one of those. And we have what I see as the end of the dark ages of a fiat and possibly a renaissance. So what do you think of it? Does that explain like this transition, all these weird big movements colliding? Explain the sort of like event horizon moment that we've seen, the spaghettification of all sort of sense, economic sense, whether it's you see Robinhood app people piling into bankrupt companies, you see negative interest rates, you see negative prices on oil. Can you tie all of those together?
Sure. It's actually kind of a boring answer. I think so. All of the generational theory, I think, is really, really valuable and important. But really, what it comes down to for me, and this is so boring because it's such an obvious answer, is the internet. This is a thing that has totally fast forwarded the rate of social evolution in a way that is radically uncomfortable for human beings. And these forces that have been unleashed, right? Like the fact that you had, just a few weeks ago, all of these big CEOs from big tech companies hauled before Congress, and it was a joke, right? I mean, these guys, all they had to do is not laugh in the faces of these congressmen and women as they scored their political points to bring home to their constituents to look tough, because then the next day they reported earnings that make everything else in the stock market look stupid, right? I mean, these institutions are so much more powerful than any human institutions we've seen. It's just insane. And that's not anyone's fault. It's just a factor of what it looks like to create massive sort of network effects at scale. And we have not been able to deal with it. And I think that if you look at a lot of these generational differences, they have to do with people who have grown up inside that versus lived through the transition versus had to come into it later in life. And that's not universally applicable. Obviously, all of those different groups are more complex than that, but we don't know how to live in internet world. And right now it looks like it's going to kill us. And so that's really, I think, at core what we're trying to figure out.
Right. Yeah. Well said. So you are a Bitcoiner, and Bitcoiner is kind of like an extension of the internet world. And let's talk about it. Where do you fall on the Bitcoin versus gold debate? That's my first question.
I mean, I don't have any issue with gold. I think Bitcoin's going to be a much more appealing, make sense gold to a different generation. My formative years were spent thinking I was going to do post-conflict resolution stuff and thinking I was going to work with refugees. So Bitcoin to me offers a whole hell of a lot of benefits over gold when you're talking about people who are fleeing borders and want to keep their wealth in the context of a political regime that's after them. So it already had some points in my column just on that standpoint.
Okay, and a second question about Bitcoin. We mentioned that Goldman Sachs says the dollar is coming to the end. Will Bitcoin play a role in a post-dollar world, or is it just going to be gold?
Bitcoin plays a role in a world where the dollar remains, but people are trying to escape their local regimes and don't want something as waffly as the dollar as it might get. But Bitcoin's going to be even more relevant in a post-dollar world. I can't see a scenario where you have competition, real meaningful competition around what the reserve currency is supposed to be, that the one thing that is truly credible and is outside the realm of a state isn't a major player.
Right. Well said. Well, Stacy, we're at the end of Summer Solutions. I thought we got some good ones.
That was a fantastic series this year.
Nathaniel Whittemore, thanks for being on Summer Solutions.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report Summer Solutions. Max and Stacy. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time. Bye, y'all.